The morning light spilled across the marble floors of St. Regis Medical, catching in the polished steel of the elevators and the glass walls that never seemed to hold fingerprints for long. Every sound felt amplified in that building, the click of heels, the hum of machines that measured lives by the second. Somewhere on the top floor, a billionaire lay unconscious, surrounded by 20 of the best doctors in the country. They spoke in hushed codes and quick decisions, their voices stitched with urgency and pride. Downstairs, in the service corridor, Evelyn walked quietly with her mop and cart. Mid-50s, uniform crisp, eyes sharper than anyone noticed. Years had pressed wisdom into the lines on her face, and beneath the rhythm of her work was a calm that people often mistook for invisibility. She knew that hospital better than anyone who wore a badge. She started her shift before sunrise, humming an old Sam Cooke tune while she checked each floor. The ICU hallway smelled like bleach and fear. She could always tell when the day would be heavy. Nurses moved quicker, eyes darted toward the double doors more often. Something big was happening. By 9, the whispers had already reached the janitorial staff. Some tech mogul, billionaire something collapsed at a fundraiser last night, one orderly said. They flew him in on a private jet, bunch of specialists, all top shelf. Evelyn nodded politely, kept mopping. She'd seen it before. People with money thought they could buy time, buy health, buy control. But in the ICU, every heart beeped the same rhythm when it was close to giving up. On the 12th floor, the air was colder, filtered cleaner. Outside room 1203 stood a small army of professionals, surgeons, toxicologists, neurologists, each with tablets and tension in their eyes. They barely noticed the housekeeper who rolled her cart past the door to empty a bin. Inside, machines whispered steady beeps. The man in the bed looked like he'd fought the night and lost, skin gray, chest rising shallow. His wife sat near the window, designer jacket folded neatly, tears silently tracking along her cheeks. A doctor leaned over her, his tone more performance than comfort. "We've tried everything," he said. "Heart, lungs, liver, all stable, but there's a neurological issue we can't pinpoint. Poison panels came back negative. We're running new labs." She nodded like she was hearing a foreign language. Evelyn watched for a second too long before catching herself. She looked down, collected the trash, and moved quietly out. At the nurse's station, one of the residents sighed. 20 people in there, and no one can figure it out. He's just fadding. Another laughed softly. "Man, got all the money in the world, can't buy a miracle." Evelyn pretended not to hear. Still, their words stayed with her, echoing behind the hum of fluorescent lights. Later that afternoon, she was back on 12 with a stack of linens when she overheard a burst of frustration. "This doesn't make sense," a younger doctor said. "His vitals keep dipping after every glucose push, like his body rejecting the sugar itself." Someone else muttered, "Just focus on the labs, not theories." They brushed past Evelyn, not even noticing they'd knocked her cart slightly out of place. One of them murmured an apology without looking up. She smiled faintly. "It's fine, baby," she said, steadying the cart. When the hallway cleared, she lingered by the open doorway. The steady rhythm of the monitor pulsed through the quiet. She caught a faint smell, chemical, sharp, not the usual antiseptic. Her eyes flicked to the tray of IV bags. Something glimmered under the plastic. She didn't speak, not yet, just noted the way the nurse hesitated before hanging a fresh drip, the slight discoloration near the connection. Years of cleaning had trained her eye to see what didn't belong. That night, while others took dinner breaks, Evelyn restocked the supply closet. A TV played news about the billionaire's empire, tech investments, political influence, charity foundations. The anchor said his condition was critical but stable. Evelyn shook her head softly. "Critical and stable don't live in the same sentence," she murmured. When she finished, she took the service elevator back up. The hallway was quiet now, lights dimmed. Inside 1203, a soft alarm pulsed. Nurses adjusted wires, whispering. Evelyn stepped close enough to see the wife asleep in a chair, head tilted against the glass. The billionaire twitched once, lips moving slightly like he was trying to speak. Evelyn glanced at the IV again, that same faint shimmer. She leaned closer, squinting, their tiny bubbles forming at the base of the line, something chemical, metallic maybe. She frowned, filed the thought away. A voice behind her snapped, "Excuse me, you can't be in here right now." A young doctor, clipboard tight in his hands, looked annoyed more than alarmed. "Sorry, sir," Evelyn said softly, "just emptying the bin." He sighed, "Fine, but make it quick. We've got critical labs coming through." He brushed past her, muttering to another doctor, "These service people just wander anywhere." The words hit harder than she expected, though not unfamiliar. She kept her head low, eyes on the trash can, until they were gone. In the stairwell later, she sat for a moment on the concrete step, hands clasped around her thermos. She let the quiet wash over her. Every muscle in her body said, "Keep working, stay small," but her instincts, the same ones that had kept her two sons safe growing up in the South Side, told her something was wrong upstairs. She closed her eyes, replaying every detail, the chemical scent, the nurse's hesitation, the bubbles. A pattern formed in her mind, slow and clear like morning light through blinds. She didn't have the degrees, but she knew contamination when she saw it. When she opened her eyes again, resolve had settled in. Tomorrow she'd find someone who'd listen, even if they laughed. Evelyn arrived early the next morning, before most of the staff clocked in. The corridors were quieter, lights dimmed to a soft amber that made every sound feel like it belonged in a cathedral. She liked those hours best. No chatter, no rush, just the hum of machines and the faint squeak of her cart wheels. On her way up, she caught a glimpse of the city waking outside the glass lobby wall. Taxis, delivery trucks, a sky blushing pink before sunrise. She took a breath, whispered a small prayer under it, and pressed the button for the 12th floor. When the doors opened, the tension was already waiting. Two doctors argued near the station. "The toxicology report's clean," one said, rubbing his forehead. "If this was poisoning, we'd see it." Evelyn slowed her steps, listening. The other doctor shook his head. "But the neurological collapse, the sugar dips, none of this adds up. The wife swears he's been eating normal. We're missing something microscopic." Evelyn pretended to check her supply list, eyes down. She could smell it again, the faint tang that didn't belong. It wasn't bleach. It wasn't medication. Something else clung to the air, almost sweet, almost metallic. Inside the room, the billionaire's condition had worsened. His skin had a pale green hue now, sweat glistening under the soft light. Machines beeped irregularly, each sound pulling at the edges of silence. Nurses moved carefully, whispering to each other, afraid to say what they were all thinking. Evelyn stepped in quietly to wipe down the windowsill. One of the young specialists glanced at her and sighed. "Ma'am, could you handle that later? We're trying to focus." She gave a small nod, lowering her gaze. "Of course, doctor." He didn't look back at her, already lost in the screen. But she saw the drip again, that same faint shimmer collecting near the base of the IV line. And now she was sure, tiny flecks clinging to the tubing like dust, except they caught the light in a way dust never could. She took a breath. "Doctor," she said softly, "I think there might be." He cut her off with a wave. "Please, not now, this is a sterile area, you can finish later." Her throat tightened, but she stayed calm. "Yes, sir." She stepped out, heart heavy. She wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of rooms where her eyes saw what others refused to. Tired of being the background in her own story. At the end of the hallway, she found the charge nurse, an older woman named Carla who'd always treated her kindly. Evelyn hesitated, then said quietly, "Miss Carla, can I ask you something? You ever smell something strange up here, something not like the usual cleaner or meds?" Carla frowned. "Strange how?" "Sweet, almost like almonds, but faint. Been smelling it near room 1203 since yesterday." The nurse's brow creased. "Almond? No, that's not from any of our supplies." Evelyn nodded. "Maybe I'm wrong, but something ain't right." Carla promised to mention it to the attending, but by noon, nothing changed. The specialists rotated again, new faces, same frustration. When the wife stepped out of the room for coffee, Evelyn caught her by the vending machine. The woman's hands shook as she tried to press the button. Evelyn reached out gently. "Ma'am, you holding up?" The woman looked up, eyes red. They keep saying they don't know. How can 20 doctors not know? Evelyn paused. Sometimes, ma'am, the truth hides in plain sight. You just need someone to look close enough. The woman blinked at her, unsure whether it was comfort or confusion. Evelyn gave a faint smile and turned away. That evening, the shift dragged on. A specialist team from DC had arrived, bringing new machines and more tension. Evelyn watched them unpack through the glass wall, their conversation sharp and clipped. No one looked her way. She was mopping when she saw a nurse remove another IV bag. The same slight discoloration ran along the tubing. Evelyn watched, waiting until the nurse stepped out. Then she leaned close. The faint almond scent was stronger now. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory from decades ago, back when she'd worked in a small-town clinic. "Girl, if you ever smell almonds and no nuts around, you move quick. That's cyanide." The thought froze her. Her heart thudded so loud she thought the machines might pick it up. She looked again, small, crystalline flecks around the connection point where the line met the needle. Whoever prepared those bags hadn't made a mistake. Someone had done this on purpose. Her breath came slow, deliberate. She straightened up, closed the trash lid, and wheeled her cart away like nothing had happened. But her mind was racing. She couldn't go to the same doctors. They hadn't listened before. She needed proof. In the supply room, she took a disposable glove and a sealed sample bag from the cleanup kit. When the hallway cleared again, she slipped into the room. The wife was praying softly by the bedside. Evelyn whispered, "Excuse me, ma'am, could I get a clean cup from your tray there? Need to replace one that cracked." The woman nodded absently. Evelyn took the empty specimen cup, removed one used IV line from the trash, and quietly sealed it in the bag. She placed it in her cart under the towels. It was nearly midnight when she reached the maintenance lab downstairs. The place was empty except for an old technician named Harold who'd worked nights for years. He looked up, surprised. "Evening, Miss Evelyn, you lost." She lowered her voice. "Harold, you still got that quick test kit from when y'all checked that water leak last month?" "Yeah, why?" "Need to test something for contamination. Can't say more yet." He frowned but nodded, trusting her. Together, they ran a basic test on the residue from the tubing. The strip turned dark blue almost instantly. Harold blinked. "Lord, that's cyanide traces." Evelyn closed her eyes. She'd hoped she was wrong. "Harold," she said, steady, "I need you to print that result. Quietly, don't tell nobody yet, just hand it to me." He hesitated. "You in trouble?" She looked at him, eyes calm but heavy. "Not yet, but someone up there's in more than they know." When she stepped back into the elevator, paper folded in her pocket, she didn't feel fear anymore, just purpose. The night pressed close around her, the hum of the machinery echoing like a heartbeat. Tomorrow she'd walk straight into that circle of white coats and tell them exactly what they missed. They might laugh again, they might roll their eyes, but this time she'd have the truth in her hand. And when the truth speaks, even the proudest rooms go silent. Morning sunlight filtered through the long windows of St. Regis Medical, the kind of light that made everything look cleaner than it felt. The world upstairs was wide awake, carts rolling, voices quick, screens glowing. Evelyn pushed her mop along the 12th floor hallway as though she'd been born to the rhythm of that place. Her movements were steady, unhurried, every motion practiced until it was invisible. But inside her, quiet fire moved. The results she'd seen last night still pressed against her chest. Something was being missed. It wasn't a mystery meant for her to solve, at least not by their rules, but she couldn't shake what she knew. The smell, the reaction, the strange way his vitals fell after certain treatments. She'd seen that pattern before, back when she worked part-time at a neighborhood clinic. People had nearly lost their lives because someone hadn't checked a label. By mid-morning, the doctors were gathered again outside room 1203. The billionaire's condition had slipped overnight. His color was worse, his pulse uneven. The specialists looked worn, frustrated, the kind of tired that made people defensive. Evelyn rolled her cart past them, nodding politely. They didn't nod back. She listened, without meaning to. One of the younger doctors was saying, "We've ruled out toxins, ruled out stroke. Everything points to metabolic collapse, but there's no trigger we can find. Another replied, he's reacting like he's allergic to his own treatment. Evelyn froze on that word, allergic. She remembered the IV label she'd seen, one with a glucose stabilizer derived from soy. She'd seen that brand cause trouble before, not because it was bad medicine, but because some people carried hidden allergies, the kind that don't show up until the body is already too weak to fight. She almost spoke, then stopped herself. Her mother's voice rose in memory, pick your moment, child. The truth's a gift, but the timing's the wrapping. She stayed silent and kept cleaning, waiting. Later, a nurse she trusted came by to collect laundry. He's worse, the nurse whispered. They're running out of ideas. Evelyn lowered her eyes. You mind if I ask what they got him on now? The nurse looked around. Same IV mix, same stabilizer. Why? Evelyn hesitated. That brand ever gets swapped, sometimes the cheaper one, made with soy protein. The nurse frowned. You think he's allergic? I think, Evelyn said slowly, his body's telling y'all something. Maybe it's time somebody listens. The nurse studied her face for a moment, then nodded slightly and slipped away. The rest of the day passed like moving through water. Evelyn worked in silence, but her mind stayed upstairs. Every sound from that direction, every distant alarm, every hurried footstep made her chest tighten. By evening, she saw the same nurse again, eyes wide with something close to disbelief. You were right, she whispered. They pulled the stabilizer. His vitals are already climbing. It was an allergy. Nobody checked the ingredient list. Evelyn's mop stopped mid-stroke. She exhaled slowly. Well, she said, voice soft as a prayer, I'm glad he's breathing easier. The nurse smiled. How did you know? Evelyn shrugged. You spend enough years cleaning up after medicine, you start learning what medicine smells like and what it don't. The nurse squeezed her arm, quick and grateful, before rushing off again. When the floor quieted, Evelyn leaned against the wall for a moment, feeling the weight slide off her shoulders. She wasn't proud, she wasn't angry, just still. All day, no one had called her name over the intercom. No one had asked how she'd known, and that was fine. Her peace didn't depend on their notice. She'd done what her conscience demanded. She thought about her sons, both grown now, how she'd told them over and over that respect didn't come from what you wore, but how you walked through a room. Stand straight, even when no one's looking. Now, in the hush of that corridor, she felt that lesson breathing back at her. Down the hall, a doctor said quietly, who figured out the allergy? Another answered. One of the nurses noticed something. Got lucky, I guess. Evelyn smiled faintly. She didn't need credit. The man in that bed had a chance to live, and that was enough. Still, part of her wished, not for praise, but for understanding. For a world that saw more than titles and coats and pay grades. For a world that believed wisdom could live anywhere, even behind a mop bucket. The next morning, the billionaire's wife stopped Evelyn in the hallway. Excuse me, she said, hesitant. You were in my husband's room the other night, weren't you? Yes, ma'am, Evelyn replied, just cleaning up. The woman looked at her for a long moment. I don't know what happened, but the doctors say someone noticed something that saved his life. Whoever it was, tell them thank you. Evelyn nodded once, eyes steady. I'll be sure they hear it, ma'am. When the woman walked away, Evelyn whispered, they already did. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself a full breath, slow, deep, grateful. The next few days passed in a rhythm only hospitals know, steady footsteps, distant alarms, the hush between breaths. Word spread quietly that the billionaire's condition was improving, though no one seemed to know why. The doctors walked a little taller, their voices lighter, as if relief itself had become a medical discovery. Evelyn said nothing. She kept wiping down counters, polishing handles, straightening trays. To most, she was still just part of the background hum of the building. But every time she passed room 1203 and heard the steady, healthy rhythm of that monitor, a quiet satisfaction warmed her chest. On the fourth morning, the press began camping outside the hospital. Cameras lined the sidewalks, lenses pointed at every passing lab coat. A headline on the TV in the cafeteria read, "Tech billionaire on road to recovery, doctors still searching for cause." Evelyn sat alone at a corner table, sipping lukewarm coffee. Around her, nurses compared updates, speculating about miracle drugs and breakthrough procedures. She didn't join in. She just watched the sunlight slide across the floor, listened to the sound of hope returning to the building. When she clocked out that afternoon, she stopped by the chapel on the first floor. The small room smelled faintly of wax and old wood. She took a seat near the back, folded her hands, and whispered, "Thank you for letting truth be louder than pride." No one heard her but the silence, and that was enough. Upstairs, the doctors prepared to brief the family. Reports were printed, charts updated, a full conference scheduled to celebrate the patient's turnaround. Evelyn passed by the open conference door on her way to deliver towels. They were all there, faces tight with focus, eyes gleaming with confidence. One of the doctors said, "We still don't know the root cause, but we've ruled out almost everything." Another added, "We may never find it, but at least he's stable." Evelyn felt a flicker of something, not anger, just a quiet ache. They were talking about miracles while the truth sat unspoken right outside their door. She kept moving, head low, footsteps soft on the tile. In the hallway, she met Carla, the nurse who'd carried her warning. Carla gave a small nod, a look that said, "I remember." Evelyn returned it, then kept walking. Later that evening, as she was refilling a supply cart, she overheard two interns talking near the vending machines. "You hear about the old housekeeper?" one said. "People say she's been working here longer than half the doctors." The other chuckled, "Guess she's seen it all." "Yeah," the first replied, "but she keeps quiet. Never seen her lose her cool, even when people talk down to her." Evelyn smiled faintly from behind the corner. They didn't know how close their words were to the truth. Silent strength wasn't about pretending not to feel, it was about choosing when feeling turned to action. By nightfall, the 12th floor glowed under soft blue light. Evelyn stood by the big window at the end of the hall, looking down at the city. The streets below shimmered with headlights. Tiny trails of motion against the quiet sky. She thought about all the rooms she'd cleaned in her 20 years there, how many stories had ended quietly behind those doors, some with loss, some with grace. She'd seen more human truth than any chart could hold. And still she chose silence, not because she was afraid, but because the truth didn't need to shout to stay real. It only needed to stand steady until the world was ready to listen. Down the hall, she heard laughter from the nurses' station. Someone mentioned a press conference planned for the next day. "They're gonna credit the medical team," one nurse said. "Whole country's watching." Evelyn smiled softly, almost tenderly. "Let them have their moment," she whispered to herself. "Mine already came." The air smelled of disinfectant and lavender polish, the scent she always left behind when her work was done. She looked once more at the reflection in the glass, steady eyes, silver strands of hair catching the light, and nodded to herself. Tomorrow would bring noise, applause, and cameras, but tonight belonged to silence. And in that silence, she felt something stronger than recognition, peace. The morning of the press conference came bright and windless. The glass walls of St. Andrew's Hospital caught the sunrise like a mirror, gold streaks sliding over steel. Report vans filled the front circle, camera rigs glinting like eyes waiting to see a miracle retold. Inside, every corridor felt scrubbed of sound. Nurses whispered, heels tapped, badges clipped neatly against white coats. Somewhere deep in the executive wing, someone rehearsed the word breakthrough. Evelyn arrived 2 hours before her shift. Habit. She set her tote in the janitor's closet, tied her apron, and started her rounds. The air smelled of citrus cleaner and fresh paint. She liked mornings before the noise, when the hospital was still half asleep and truth could breathe. By mid-morning, she could already feel it. The building was humming. Doctors walked in pairs, reporters clustered near the elevator banks, and in the cafeteria, screens replayed the same headline. 20 doctors stunned as Billionaire's health bounces back. Mystery cure sparks debate. They were calling it a phenomenon. They were calling it luck. They weren't calling it what it really was: observation, instinct, and a housekeeper's quiet knowing. On the top floor, conference room lights flared to life. Microphones were clipped, chairs straightened, and a pale blue banner read, "Innovation in Critical Care, a Case Study in Collaboration." The billionaire's son, a young man with a tired face, stood off to the side, hands buried in his pockets. Evelyn saw him briefly when she passed by with a mop bucket, his eyes distant, grief and hope still tangled. She kept moving. In the press room, Dr. Whitmore, the lead physician, adjusted his tie, scanning his notes. "Let's keep it simple," he told his team. "We talk about perseverance, teamwork, and discovery. No speculation, no individual credit. This is about the hospital." Carla, the nurse who'd carried Evelyn's warning, stood at the back. Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. When the conference began, cameras clicked like insects. Whitmore spoke in a measured tone, confident, rehearsed. He thanked the specialists, the nurses, the laboratory, the staff. He paused just long enough for the applause to rise, then continued. "Sometimes, medicine reminds us that faith and science walk hand in hand, and in this case, both prevailed." Evelyn listened from the hallway, one hand resting on her cleaning cart. The words were polished, careful, like marble covering dust. Then, as he spoke, the billionaire's son raised a hand. "Excuse me, doctor," he said. His voice was calm but steady enough to still the room. "I just have one question. If all of this was teamwork, whose observation changed my father's treatment plan last week?" Whitmore hesitated. The cameras tilted his way. "We had several inputs from—" "No, I checked the logs," the son interrupted. "A note came through on the patient file last Tuesday night. Someone suggested checking for an environmental factor. That's what led to the correction, right?" Whitmore blinked. "That's correct, but that note came through a secondary channel. We're still reviewing who." Carla cleared her throat. "It came from housekeeping," she said quietly. The room froze. Reporters leaned in. Whitmore's face tightened. "Housekeeping." Carla nodded once. From Evelyn Marks, she'd noticed something unusual when she cleaned the room. A murmur rippled through the crowd, rising like wind in a wheat field. Evelyn stood still in the doorway, eyes lowered. The billionaire's son turned toward her. "Is that true?" Evelyn looked up, meeting his gaze. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick, respectful, almost holy. Then she said softly, "I just saw what everyone else was too busy to see." The flash of cameras lit her face. Whitmore started to speak, then stopped himself. The words he might have used, lucky, coincidence, misunderstanding, all felt too small now. Reporters called out questions. Someone asked for her full name. Another asked how long she'd worked there. Evelyn answered none of them. She just nodded politely, turned her cart, and began to walk away. But the son spoke again. "Ma'am," he said, voice carrying across the room, "you saved my father's life. I think people should know your name." Evelyn paused at the doorway, the mop handle catching the light. She turned just enough for the cameras to catch her smile, small, humble, proud. "Names don't matter much," she said quietly. "What matters is that folks start seeing who's been here all along." And with that, she left the room. Behind her, the air shifted. Reporters murmured, staff exchanged looks, and Dr. Whitmore stood motionless, his reflection trembling faintly in the glass wall beside him. For the first time, the story didn't belong to science, or status, or polished men in white coats. It belonged to the truth, and the woman who carried it without needing to shout. Down the corridor, Evelyn moved in silence, her footsteps echoing softly on the tile. The cameras might forget her name by next week. The papers might shorten her part to a sentence. But the people in that room, the ones who saw her, really saw her, would never forget the weight of that quiet grace. And somewhere, deep in the quiet of the ward, a monitor kept its steady rhythm, the same one she'd listened to in the dark. Proof that sometimes, salvation doesn't come from noise or titles, just from someone willing to notice. The hallway outside the conference room buzzed like a hive after someone had lifted the lid. Reporters swarmed the exit, microphones catching fragments of questions that tangled in the air, words like hero, housekeeper, miracle. Evelyn walked straight through them, eyes calm, pace even. The light of a dozen cameras caught the shine on her cart handle and the silver at her temples. Someone shouted her name, another asked for a photo, but she didn't break stride. She had floors to clean and a shift to finish. Inside the conference room, the silence was heavier than the noise outside. Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Well," he said finally, "it appears collaboration takes many forms." The audience didn't applaud this time. Respect had replaced spectacle. By the afternoon, the story had escaped the hospital walls. News anchors replayed the clip of Evelyn's single line, "I just saw what everyone else was too busy to see." Social media called her the silent healer, the woman who watched closely. Comment sections filled with stories of nurses, cleaners, receptionists, the ones who worked in the background and rarely got credit. Evelyn didn't see any of it. She was back in the supply room folding linens, humming softly to herself. Carla found her there, phone in hand, eyes wide. "You're everywhere, honey," she said. "They're calling you a national inspiration." Evelyn smiled. "Internet moves faster than mops, I guess." Carla laughed. "They want you upstairs, administration. Don't make me drag you." Reluctantly, Evelyn followed her to the executive office. The same administrators who'd walked past her 100 times without a glance were now standing when she entered. Whitmore was there too, looking smaller somehow, his pride worn down to sincerity. He gestured to a chair. "Ms. Marks, we owe you an apology and our thanks. You reminded us why this work matters." Evelyn sat carefully, folding her hands. "You don't owe me anything, sir. You saved the man's life. I just noticed a label." Whitmore shook his head. "Sometimes noticing is the saving." He slid an envelope across the table. "The hospital board approved a full scholarship program in your name for staff pursuing medical or nursing degrees. They're calling it the Marks Initiative." Evelyn's breath caught. "That's too much." "No," he said softly, "it's the least we can do." For a moment the room was still, sunlight stripping the floor in gold. Evelyn reached out, touched the envelope but didn't open it. "Then promise me something," she said. "Don't let it stop at my name. There are folks all over this building who see what others miss. Listen to them." Whitmore nodded. "We will." She stood, nodded politely, and left the office the same way she'd entered, quietly. But the atmosphere around her had changed. Orderlies smiled when she passed, nurses touched her shoulder in thanks, even security guards tipped their hats. That night, when the halls were empty and the city lights blinked beyond the glass, Evelyn took one last walk through the 12th floor. The machines hummed their gentle song, monitors pulsing like heartbeats in rhythm with her steps. She paused outside room 1203. Inside, the billionaire was awake now, thin and pale, but breathing on his own. His wife sat beside him, fingers intertwined with his. Through the window, Evelyn saw the man look up and whisper something to his wife. She turned and spotted Evelyn standing outside. The woman rose, opened the door. "You're the one," she said softly. "You're the reason he's still here." Evelyn shook her head. "I just did my job, ma'am." The woman smiled through tears. "No, you saw him. You saw what everyone else missed." Evelyn didn't know what to say, so she just nodded once, eyes warm. "You'll take care of each other now." As she turned to leave, the billionaire's faint voice called after her, rough from days of silence. "Thank you," he said. She paused, smiled without turning back. "You're welcome, sir." Walking down the hall, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a shadow on the edge of someone else's story, but as proof that quiet truth still carried weight. At the elevator, she pressed the button and looked at her reflection in the silver doors. Same uniform, same worn shoes, same calm eyes. But something inside her had shifted. She wasn't invisible anymore. And somewhere beyond those glass walls, the world was learning what she'd always known. You don't need a title, to hold wisdom, or a spotlight to show grace. Sometimes all it takes is silence that refuses to look away. The story broke wide open before dawn. By breakfast, every network was replaying the clip of Evelyn leaving the press room, calm, humble, refusing applause. The caption read, "The housekeeper who taught the world to listen." In the staff cafeteria, the TVs hung from the ceiling like watching eyes. Nurses stopped mid-bite, janitors leaned on brooms, even doctors stood still. It wasn't gossip anymore, it was pride. Across town, talk shows quoted her line, "I just saw what everyone else was too busy to see." In that single sentence, people found themselves, teachers, clerks, cashiers, mechanics, the quiet ones who kept things running while the world looked the other way. Evelyn didn't watch. She spent her morning the same way she always did, checking floors, replacing sheets, wiping down chrome that reflected back the shape of her own unshakable patience. But every few steps, someone stopped her. "You're Miss Evelyn, right?" a nurse asked. "My mama told me to tell you thank you." Another said softly, "You made me proud to wear my badge." Even Dr. Whitmore stopped her in the hall. "The Foundation's phones haven't stopped ringing," he said, voice more awe than authority. "Hospitals across the country are reviewing their staff protocols because of you." She smiled gently. "It's not because of me, sir. It's because folks remembered to pay attention." Downstairs, the hospital PR team fielded calls from universities, newspapers, even the governor's office. Someone had suggested a medal, another suggested a documentary. Evelyn declined both. "You can't package truth," she said simply. "It belongs to whoever listens." By the end of the week, the Marks Initiative launched officially, a scholarship fund for support staff pursuing nursing and healthcare degrees. Photos of the signing spread online. Evelyn didn't attend the ceremony, though her name was printed in bold on the banner. She was on the 4th floor, mopping a hallway no one had thought to photograph. That night, the billionaire's son found her there. He looked different, relaxed, grounded, his designer suit replaced by simple clothes. In his hands, he carried a small wooden box. "My father wanted you to have this," he said. "He's too weak to walk up here yet, but he wrote you a letter." Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron before taking it. "Tell him he didn't have to do that." The son smiled. "He said you'd say that." When he left, she opened the letter. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "Ms. Marks, I owe my life to your eyes and your silence. You saw me not as a man of wealth, but as a man in need. I will spend what years I have left making sure others are seen too. Thank you for reminding me what grace looks like." She folded it carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into her pocket. Some gifts didn't need display. Outside, the city lights blinked against the glass, and traffic murmured like the sea. News anchors still debated the meaning of it all, what her story said about class, race, and humility. But inside those hospital walls, something quieter had taken root. Doctors stopped to greet custodians by name. Nurses listened when porters mentioned odd smells or sounds. Meetings ended with one last question: did we ask everyone? That was the real reckoning, small, steady acts of respect, rebuilding a culture from the ground up. One evening, as Evelyn was leaving, a young intern ran up to her. "Ma'am," he said, breathless, "I saw how you handled them cameras. You didn't look scared at all." She smiled. "Baby, fear's just loud doubt. Quiet don't mean scared." He nodded, thoughtful, before heading back inside. Outside the hospital, the air carried the faint chill of autumn. The sidewalks glowed with streetlights and evening rain. Evelyn paused by the fountain in front of the main entrance. The same one patients, families always passed on their way to hope or heartbreak. She sat on the edge, letting the mist kiss her hands. Her reflection wavered in the water, haloed by the city's shimmer. She thought of all the people she'd met in those corridors, some who never saw her, some who finally did. The reckoning wasn't in headlines or scholarships. It was in hearts learning to see the unseen. A nurse walking by called out, "Good night, Miss Evelyn." Evelyn smiled, lifting a hand in return. "Night, sweetheart, see you tomorrow." As she rose to leave, she glanced back at the building. Through the lit windows, she could see motion, life, grace still unfolding. The same place, but somehow changed. Inside, Respect had learned to breathe again. And outside, beneath the hum of traffic and the whisper of wind, Evelyn whispered to herself, "Justice don't always wear a badge. Sometimes it just wears patience." The ripples didn't stop at the hospital gates. Within a week, Evelyn's name reached places she'd never been: newsrooms, podcasts, classrooms where teachers played her clip to remind students that wisdom had no uniform. Editorials called her story a mirror held up to society. They said she hadn't just saved a man, she'd restored the meaning of the word respect. But Evelyn didn't care much for headlines. She still took the same bus to work, sat by the same window, carried the same thermos of sweet tea. Every morning she'd nod at the driver, and every morning he'd grin back and say, "Morning, Miss Evelyn, you trending again." She'd chuckle softly, "Better trending than trippin', I guess." The world wanted her story to be a miracle, but she knew it was simpler than that. It was about paying attention, about dignity, not drama. Still, some changes couldn't be ignored. The hospital board offered her a position in patient advocacy. "You've got the kind of voice people listen to," they told her. Evelyn had smiled politely. "I've spent 30 years learning to listen. Maybe that's where I belong." And so she stayed right where she was, on the floors, in the rooms where truth was easiest to hear. But now, when she entered a space, people turned toward her instead of away. Doctors paused their conversations to greet her. Patients, families smiled when she walked in. She had become the quiet conscience of the building. One afternoon, a reporter from a national magazine arrived for an interview. They found her in a stairwell, wiping down a handrail. "Miss Marks," the reporter said, voice soft with awe, "the world wants to know what you plan to do next." Evelyn straightened slowly, eyes kind but steady. "Next," she repeated, "same thing I did yesterday, keep the floors clean and the truth clear." The reporter laughed gently. "You don't want to write a book, start a foundation." She shook her head. "Child, some of us are meant to live stories, not sell 'em." That line made the article's headline, though she never read it herself. The reckoning spread beyond St. Andrews. Hospitals across the country began holding what they called Evelyn Rounds, sessions where every staff member, from the chief surgeon to the night janitor, was invited to share what they'd observed. New policies were named after her, though she never asked for them. She only hoped they last longer than the applause. Back home, her neighbors treated her like the same woman who'd watched their kids when they were late for work. The local church honored her one Sunday morning with a seat at the front. The pastor spoke about grace that walks quietly but leaves deep footprints. When he asked her to say a few words, Evelyn stood and looked out at faces she'd known her whole life. "I'm no hero," she said softly. "I just didn't look away. Truth's everywhere. It just needs eyes that care enough to see it." The congregation rose to their feet, not cheering but clapping in a slow, reverent rhythm. Later that evening, she sat on her porch, watching the sun melt behind the rooftops. Children laughed down the street, chasing the last light of day. The air smelled of honeysuckle and fresh rain. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, a message from Carla with a photo of the new plaque mounted at the hospital entrance. It read, "Dedicated to Evelyn Marks, whose quiet strength reminded us that every voice matters." Evelyn smiled, setting the phone aside. She didn't need plaques. The sound of laughter drifting through her neighborhood was enough proof that the world still had kindness left in it. She leaned back, eyes tracing the deepening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, long and low. She thought of the billionaire, now home with his family, his life measured in gratitude instead of dollars. She thought of the nurses, the janitors, the young interns learning to listen. Justice had come, not as punishment, but as awareness, not as vengeance, but as respect. She took a slow breath, let the evening settle around her like an old hymn, and whispered, "That's enough." Because it was. Night came soft over the city, the kind that painted every window gold before fading to quiet blue. Evelyn sat by her small kitchen window, a cup of tea steaming between her hands. The day's noise had finally gone still. The radio hummed low in the background, a talk show discussing kindness and courage. Someone mentioned her name, called her the quiet woman who reminded us that heroes don't always speak loud. She reached over and turned the dial down. She'd heard enough words about herself to last a lifetime. What mattered to her wasn't the sound of her name, it was the silence that followed, the space where people started to think differently. She thought back to that first morning, the smell of disinfectant and tension, the looks that slid past her, how it all began with one detail no one cared to see. Now, the same halls she once walked unseen carried her presence like a heartbeat. People listened differently, looked longer, paused before they judged. That was her miracle. Outside, the streetlights blinked awake. The world looked washed clean after a brief rain. She thought about her sons, both grown, raising their own families now, one a teacher, the other a paramedic. They'd called her that week, voices thick with pride. "Mama," her youngest said, "you didn't just help that man, you helped all of us." She laughed softly then. "Baby, I just did what needed doing." Now, sitting alone, she whispered that line again, letting it roll slow and steady like a prayer. From her window, she could see the hospital lights glowing in the distance. It looked small from here, but she knew every corner of it, the echo in the stairwell, the hum of the ICU at dawn, the rhythm of lives starting over. Sometimes she still couldn't believe that her small act had carried so far, but that was the beauty of truth. It didn't need help traveling. It just needed release. She closed her eyes, let the warmth of the tea sink into her palms. For the first time in years, her mind felt light, uncluttered. She thought about all the people who'd been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. People like her everywhere, carrying quiet strength the world didn't notice until it needed saving. Her mother's old words came back to her. Respect ain't about who talks loudest. It's about who keeps standing when the noise fades. Evelyn smiled. She finally understood what that meant. She rose, turned off the radio, and stepped outside to the porch. The air was cool, stars faint behind the city's glow. Somewhere a train passed, its distant rumble mixing with the hum of traffic. She leaned against the railing and whispered to the night. "Some battles are won without raising your voice, only by standing tall." The words drifted upward, soft and sure. And if anyone had been listening just then, really listening, they might have felt what she felt, peace. The kind that comes when justice doesn't roar but settles quietly like evening light on still water. She took one last sip of tea, set the cup down, and smiled to herself. "If you've ever been doubted or dismissed," she murmured, "this story's yours too. Remember, quiet doesn't mean weak. Sometimes silence is the loudest strength there is." The night held her words like a promise. And for the first time in a long time, the world felt right.